On December 29th of 1170, as Wikipedia demurely puts it, the tenure of Thomas of Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury came to an end. Though another way of expressing it is that he was brutally murdered by 4 drunken knights on the orders of his former boss, King Henry II of England. And that version has made it into popular culture, including Blackadder, because essentially it's true. But there's a great deal more to it, and essentially it's a happy ending for the people of the free world, and even in a certain sense for Thomas, because as a pious Christian, being martyred is not the worst thing that can possibly happen to you. See, Becket had been a secular official. He'd been a loyal servant of the king, so much so that he was made Lord Chancellor, in which capacity he eagerly assisted the king in raising money, including from the church. So then Henry had him made Archbishop of Canterbury on the belief that this would bring the church even more firmly under the king's thumb. But something extraordinary happened. Becket turned out to be as loyal a servant of the church once he was made a cleric as he had been a loyal servant of the king while he was still operating in that capacity. And he immediately clashed with the king over his attempts to control the church. In the end, the king blew up. Becket had to flee the country. He eventually came back, but was promptly murdered. Apparently, you shouldn't really trust Henry II all that much. But what's really striking about it is that in the aftermath, Henry was beaten by his dead former employee because the murder created a scandal throughout Europe. People were shocked, they were appalled, and their dismay at the event had such strong practical consequences that eventually Henry had to more or less take responsibility for it, do penance, come and throw himself naked on the floor of the cathedral and be flogged by monks, and agree to give the church more freedom. And that is a remarkable development. And from the modern point of view, the whole thing might seem obvious that that's what should have happened, but it's not that simple because you have to ask yourself, how do you control the actions of government? And of course, there could be all sorts of institutional mechanisms, but behind them all, there must be an aroused public opinion that will not tolerate wrongdoing. And how is this supposed to be channeled? And if you're looking at 12th century England, this is a culture that is overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. This is long before the break with Rome under Henry VIII, leading to the murder of Thomas More. But that's another story. And so the church needs to be able to pass judgment on the behavior of the king, including, as they had with King John, remember, excommunicating him if he was sufficiently villainous. And it should matter. But it shouldn't matter so much that the church effectively becomes the state, because then the church is corrupted. It becomes a secular authority with all the defects that that implies, including who's then going to check the church. But if the king is dependent on the approval of the church for the legitimacy of his rule, then of course the king is going to want to control the church, as people like Henry II always did, seeking to determine who would become archbishop. And that was part of the whole argument that had gotten John excommunicated as well. So how are we, in fact, to regulate the relationship between church and state? And the answer has to be that the church's voice is influential, but not legally binding. And that the king is entitled to have the church subject to the normal law of the land so that it can't engage in sedition or stage coups, but not that it be the real power behind the throne. And it's interesting, as a side note, Becket's secretary was a man named John of Salisbury. And while at the court of Henry II, prior to the murder of Becket, Salisbury had written a book called Pollock Atticus about government that included the fact that a tyrant is not a legitimate ruler and that a tyrant should be murdered. So there's the church speaking with the right sort of authoritative voice, not actually carrying out the murder, but stating that citizens have the legitimate right to resist an unjust government. And when Henry had Becket murdered, it turned out that in England, that sentiment was so strong that Henry didn't himself have to be assassinated. He was brought to heel by the outrage at the nation over the murder of a pious archbishop. And that is a very healthy balance. And in the aftermath, I mean, it took a long time. The Anglican Church is still formally established. It took a long time, really, to manage to render unto Caesar that which was Caesar's and unto God that which was God's, and keep the right balance between Caesar's right to impose laws on clergy as citizens of the realm and the church's right to pass stern moral judgment on the king without secretly becoming the king. These things are not easy, but a much better solution was found in the English-speaking world than anywhere else. And in a weird kind of way, and I'm not justifying murdering Thomas of Becket, of course, but the fact that he was murdered and that it led to the humiliation of the king was a major step forward in this direction, even though it would, of course, have been better If Henry had never uttered those fateful words, "Who shall rid me of this turbulent priest?" or if those 4 knights hadn't been so drunk they went, "Oh, we'll do it," and thus Becket's biographical entry wouldn't have said that his tenure as archbishop ended on December 29th of 1170, along with his earthly existence. But it's a victory for all of us that it turned out the way it did, despite the unfortunate incident that took place in the cathedral. If you're enjoying these commentaries, please visit my website, that's www.johnrobson.ca, and make a monthly pledge to keep me in business. And also, of course, keep subscribing to The Rebel, keep supporting The Rebel.